as you saw from the title, I really want to talk to you guys today about creating fantasy names for your places, races, and religions. This could also apply to other things. You know, I feel like my methods here are going to work for a lot of different things, but those are the main areas that I personally have been really having to work out. You know, okay, how do I actually go about naming these things? Because obviously I don't want to just have everything have some kind of like, you know, English name or whatever, right? I want them to sound as realistic and each nation as like unique and foreign to the other as we have in our real world. That just makes the most sense and it seems the most fun. But this can also be a really challenging process. And so I want to share with you guys the couple of different ways that I've personally been figuring this out, and it's really fun, and I hope at the very least it can give you some inspiration. So let's jump in. First off, my first tip is based off of real world history as well as real world mythologies, right? Where do places get their names from? And the reason I include myths in there is because if you go back to like ancient times, there are plenty of places, especially that have been named after mythic events that have taken place there, right? Or just like mythic concepts, right? You can see this with like I think it's in Ireland. There's a couple of mountains that I believe are still to this day referred to as the Peps of Anu, which basically means like the breasts of the mother goddess. Which is really cool. You can also see this like all over Greece, of course, like we know so much about their myths already. But you can also see this in Rome. There are places that mythic things happened, and a lot of the times their names come from something to do with that event. But also real world events. And I think, like, even though I'm talking real world events, I think George Martin does an amazing job of this in Game of Thrones. And the most off the top of the head example I can think of is King's Landing, right? That's a historic event in his world. That's where Aegon the Conqueror landed. And so the city he built there got named King's Landing, and the name kind of stuck because they were the ruling family for so many years. So that's the first place that I take inspiration. But also, like I said, I don't want to have just all of my names for all of my different nations sounding the same, just like written in English or whatever. That'd be really boring. The second tip I have for you guys is really fun. Basically, I sit down and I make a list of. So if you look at real world religions, there's always like similar ways you can see that they like if it's written in like the same alphabet that you're already used to, first off, because I'm not talking about creating like a whole new language that would be, you know, different symbols or characters or whatever than what we use. You can do that if you want, but I don't know how you'd actually write that in a book. So obviously that's not what I'm referring to. But if you look at any of the languages that are going to use the same like letters that we do, right? You can tell at the ends of them they have similar endings, right? Like so in French, there's a lot of things that end in like a QUE or like silent letters. Things get silent, right? I think you get what I'm saying with that. So I sit down and I basically make a list of like 3 to 5 different ways that words can end or different sounds that are, you know, letters and stuff like that that would go together commonly in that language. And then after I have those lists for each, then when I go through and name everything, I try to find, again, more sounds to fill out the rest of the words or the names for things and places and whatever. And I try to find things that sound like they flow. And I hope this makes sense. Maybe I'm just a weirdo, but when I was a kid, I always used to like really want to speak a bunch of different languages. So I would just make up stuff all the time. So for me, it like kind of is a little bit natural at this point for me to be able to sit here and just like say stuff out loud and see like this kind of sounds like it would be a thing, you know? So I hope that makes sense. But it definitely makes it easier. And again, if you're like, I don't know if I already said this or not, but the idea is that like if somebody looks at my map, they will be able to tell by the names of all of the cities on here, or even like rivers or mountain ranges or anything, that they'll be able to tell who named it. because they'll all sound kind of similar, right? So you don't have to write an entire language. You don't have to make an entire thing up. You just need to make it sound realistic, right? Like definitely a cheat, but it's very helpful. So that's the first thing that I've done. Another thing that I wanted to throw out there though is that like sometimes even that process can be really challenging. I fully understand. And so this other tip is kind of how do I even start this? It's kind of a long one, but basically, so each of the nations in my personal world I'm basing their cultures off of different combinations of real world cultures. Whether they're ancient and like dead and gone, don't exist anymore cultures, or still exist, but I'm not talking about like I don't even think the right word is cultural appropriation, but I'm not talking about taking someone's culture and stealing it and putting it into a fantasy world. I kind of have personal problems with that because it can just be very problematic. So that's not what I'm talking about doing. What I'm saying is blending. So for each of my nations, depending on like the type of nature that they're surrounded by, whether they're desert people or mountain people, etc., right? I am using real world inspiration from cultures that would have also existed in those times, like how they would dress, the kinds of things they would eat, stuff like that, right? And since I don't want to take something that's just copied and pasted real world culture for my fantasy, I want to be more imaginative than that. I am doing kind of a blend of anywhere from like 2 to 4 different cultures, and kind of like mixing and matching them enough that like they are going to feel like their own thing, their own fantasy type thing, right? That's the idea. That's what I hope it comes across as in my series by the time it's fully written. And so the reason I'm saying that is because if I get stuck naming something, and I just can't, I'm just tapped out because like it's a lot of names, right? So if I get tapped out and I don't want to think of just some kind of English words for the name, I will I'll think of like, okay, if you think of like anything that's got a name, it's usually something like a really short phrase, like warrior of God, right? Like, I think that's what Michael means or something like that, right? So it's a short phrase, or it just means like, one thing. Or like, I think Adrian it's one of my favorite names, but I think in like Latin, it means like woman from the sea or something like that, right? So you don't have to think of anything super complex, but I'll try to think of again, those are names for like actual like people, but you can do the same thing with your city, right? So if there's a specific story attached to that city or that religion or something like that, then coming up with some kind of phrase, even if it's very simplistic, and then I will like do like a Google search. I'll look at those couple different cultures that I'm using inspiration from, and I'll type in like translate this from English into this language, and we'll see what comes up, right? And I'll see the words, and like I said, I'll kind of go through and I'll see which ones I like how they sound the most, and that sound the most like they could kind of fit with the words I've already created for that particular culture. And once I do that, then I'll kind of tweak it. Now, I know this is like probably a little complex to understand, so I'm going to show you. Okay, so I can't find my dry erase marker. I don't know. So hopefully you guys will be able to read this paper that I'm about to show you. But this is basically the idea that I was going for. So in my world, there is a like monster, demonic, evil kind of creature, right? And I wanted to name it something that sounded kind of evil, right? Or that sounded like something that would fit. And the particular culture of people that give this creature a name are based in a lot of ways off of more Celtic, Irish or Nordic kind of countries to some degree, right? And so I looked at a bunch of different words, and I ended up settling on doing like a using Gaelic and then kind of tweaking it, right? So I'm just going to show you because I don't know if I'm explaining this very well. So the idea is, okay, so here's English. I decided to go with death leech, right? And saw what would come up for that. Sometimes I change the phrases around just to see what I can find the coolest stuff for. Play with it as you will, right? But I went with death leech. In Gaelic, this is, I'm going to say it wrong, I'm sorry. Bas or ba, lech, lek, I don't know. I have no idea. But this is the Gaelic word, right? Or the Gaelic words for these things. And so what I ended up coming up with is a Balek, which to me does sound like some kind of ancient creepy ass demon, right? So it's really, really simple. It's also kind of a fun process to do that, at least in my nerdy opinion. But hopefully that can give you some inspiration. Now, I do have one more little tip to throw in there. Hopefully it's not like super long. Wow, I wish like people would stop walking past my house or whatever is happening. So, sorry, my dog has been making me crazy all morning. So, let's get into this because the other tip that is something that was really helpful to me when it came to coming up with names for any of these things, right? Again, can work for anything, places, even races, to some degree, religions, whatever, right? But a lot of these things are named after actual people, right? Whether they were like, mythic people or like actually real like historical figures. Think how many places did Alexander the Great name after himself, right? How many cities? So perfect real world example there. What about like when it comes to Buddhism, right? It was named after the Buddha, right? So I looked at a lot of things like this and kind of realized a lot of them, it's just named after people or demigods or something like that, right? Heroes, enlightened people, whatever, right? Like when it comes to religion, especially, even if they weren't necessarily enlightened, they had their own subjective spiritual epiphany and decided to share it with other people, and it became a religion, right? So I did this for literally all of my nations that I have created in different ways, right? And it's been super fun. So I wanted to kind of give you a rundown of some of the ways that I went about doing that. For a couple of my nations, they are very much for one of them, the nation itself took on the name of the person who founded the nation. Who really, and by founded, I mean who united it. Because it used to be just a whole bunch of warring tribes back in the day, and then this particular individual, like several hundred years before the story starts, is the one who actually brought all the people together into like one unified culture, right? And so they took on a version of that person's last name as the name of their people, right? Another one, they took on a name of a very sacred goddess, who made whether it's myth or reality, I am leaving up to a lot of, whoever reads my story, I want them to be able to just kind of like take it as they will, right? But these are the religious and mythical beliefs of the nations in my world at the very least. And so they took on a name of this goddess who they have a very like important story about. And she did something really important for their people, supposedly, right? And so they not only took on her name for their people, but they also named their very first city after her. Another one of mine, I created their name, again, in the same processes I've already told you about. I came up with a name for them, and in their language, it means something very specific that links all the way back to, again, the founding of their own culture. In a very specific way. It has to do with kind of the story of how they became who they are as a people. And so their name in their language translates to a very specific phrase. So the fourth nation, this is the last one I'm going to tell you guys about today, but I had a lot of fun with this one too. I had fun with all of them. But the way that they came up with the name for themselves as a people as well as their country, basically this particular nation, this particular race in my world has a special type of magic that only their people utilize. And the way they utilize it especially is very unique, and it's the thing that brings them together as a people. It's incredibly sacred to them. It's part of their religion, but also part of their identity. So the word that they have in their own language for that type of magic is the word that they ended up using a version of to name themselves as a people, and therefore like their entire country became known as this particular name. So I hope that these were helpful suggestions to you. It's been incredibly handy to me personally to be able to go through and do this process. It's working out. I haven't had too many issues coming up with names since I came up with this process, but I would definitely love to hear if you have a way that you do it. Please share, comment below. I would love to know how you go about it, because I can never find enough help when it comes to naming things. It's a big world I'm creating, and I mean, it's a process. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. How do you go about it? Was any of this helpful to you? Let me know. To those who are already here, who have already been here for a minute, thank you. All my subscribers, deeply appreciate y'all. If you're new here, please consider liking, sharing, subscribing, all of that kind of stuff. And I will see y'all very, very soon. Happy writing.